Welcome back to Science Chapter 3, Lesson 3, How Do Humans Affect the Survival of Plant Species? So before we start with today's lesson, let's do a little bit of review of what we've talked about so far in this chapter. There are two parts of photosynthesis, the light reactions, which require light, and the dark reactions, which do not require light. In the light reactions, atoms are rearranged to form simple sugars which plants use as food. Oxygen is a waste product of this process. The dark reactions use ATP and NADPH to capture and release energy in PGAL, which is used to build starch and cellulose. Food and water are transported through vascular tissues, the phloem and the xylem. In transpiration process, plant leaves lose water through tiny holes called stromata. Water is pulled up the xylem during transpiration and exits the plant through the stromata. Meristem cells divide continually, creating new tissues for the plant as it grows. Plant hormones send messages to cells to switch on certain genes, which helps to direct the growth. Plants respond to stimuli and changes in their environmental conditions in a variety of ways. Tropism is plant movement in response to the direction of a stimulus. Movement towards a stimulus is a positive tropism, while movement away from a stimulus is a negative tropism. Plants' directional response to light is phototropism. Geotropism is the response of a plant to the effects of gravity. Trimotopism is a plant's movement or growth response to touch. Other plant adaptations include seed dispersal and structural adaptations for ecosystems. So now let's move into today's lesson. What are some places in your community where plants have not survived? What are some native plants in your area or region that have gone extinct or are endangered or threatened? Plants that are well adapted to their environment survive, thrive, and reproduce. Here's a little fun fact. All the images that you're going to see today in this slideshow are plants that are either endangered or they're extinct in the wild, but some scientists have managed to keep them alive through growth, but they don't grow in the wild anymore. So that's just kind of a fun thing to look forward to for each of the plants you're going to see today. During catastrophic environmental events in Earth's history, such as floods, climate changes, tectonic events, species of plants, as well as animals and other organisms, have disappeared in large numbers. The dramatic changes to their ecosystems challenge many species beyond their ability to adapt. When all members of a species have died off, the species will become extinct. Generally, when we think of extinct, we think of animals, and very rarely do we actually think of plants becoming extinct. Just like with animals' extinction, most of what we know about the extinction of plants is based upon the fossils that are left behind. Environmental disruptions such as extreme climate changes and meteorological events affect the number and the ranges of plants, and sadly, many do not survive. The result is that thousands of plant species that lived long ago are now extinct. Think about how humans depend upon plants. What do you think would happen if the plants on Earth disappeared? Because we see so many plants around us almost everywhere we go, we tend to forget that the disappearance of an entire species from Earth, and it can seem like an exaggeration. However, species do disappear, and some scientists estimate that 99% of all species that have ever lived here on Earth have now become extinct. So we are only seeing what scientists believe is 1% of all the plants that have ever existed. In addition, the rate of extinctions has been increased by human activities as they change the environment so that species can no longer survive. Scientists estimate that about 300,000 plant species exist on Earth today. Because of this, the Center for Biological Diversity has evaluated about 12,900 of them. The studies indicate that 68% of evaluated plants are currently threatened with extinction. Like all living organisms, each plant species is adapted to live in a certain range of environmental conditions. Unlike most animals, plants are unable to move as the environmental conditions change. Habitat loss is the primary cause of species loss. Urban development, fire, agriculture, and logging are some of the causes of these habitational losses. Habitat loss can be harmful to more than one species at a time. It can destroy an entire natural communities. Habitat loss is also a problem because it fragments a habitat. When a habitat is fragmented, it is divided into smaller areas. The edges around an area of land will have a set of conditions that is different from the conditions in the interior of the area. As land is fragmented, the amount of border areas is going to increase. Global warming has caused, and may continue to cause, dramatic changes to the disruption of plants around the world. In some places, plant species can survive these changes as their seeds spread to more favorable conditions. Another factor that can contribute to plant species loss is pollution. There are many reasons why we should reduce our impact on the extinction rate, and this is just one more reason. Humans have a responsibility to be stewards and caretakers of all creation. When one species is lost, many other species in the same habitat may be affected. Extinction disrupts the balance of nature. There are also economic as well as environmental impacts. For example, the extinction of plant species affects our ability to continue to discover new medicines. So an interesting solution has come about. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault stores seeds so that we can revive a struggling plant species. So this is actually really cool, where in basically a neutral area up in the Arctic, I believe it's in the, anyway, it's where it's really, really cold. Everyone across all these different nations, they store their seeds there. So if something does happen, they can go get those seeds and just kind of regenerate their plant population. Pretty smart idea. Plants that live naturally in an environment are called a native species. Native species are well adapted to their environment. They interact with other organisms in predictable and stable ways. One of the most widespread native species in the United States is the goldenrod plant, which is found in every state except Hawaii. On this slide, you can see an image of the goldenrod plant. This is one of the few pictures in this slideshow that is not an example of an extinct or endangered plant species. The stability of ecosystems is disturbed when the introduction of an exotic species, which are non-native species, are introduced by natural process or by human activity. Humans may introduce exotic species either intentionally or accidentally. When an exotic species harms the environment, it's then called an invasive species. An invasive species spreads rapidly and competes with the native species. Many invasive species cause economic damage. The nodding thistle is an example of an invasive species. If you don't know what a nodding thistle is, on this slide is an image of it. It is native to Eurasia and was most likely brought to North America as a garden plant. It now invades meadows, prairies, and pasture lands all across the United States and Canada. It grows in large clumps that crowd out native plants and hinders the movement of livestock. Each flower can produce as many as 1,200 seeds. The seeds spread in the wind and attach to the fur of animals and to the clothes of hikers. They can stay dormant in the soil for 16 years and still germinate, so it's very hard to get rid of these particular plants. But it's not just those plants. Just controlling any invasive species is incredibly difficult, whether it's animal or plant. So here's a list of some control methods that are used to control plant invasive species. First is the mechanical, where plants are pulled up from the ground by hand or using a machine. You've done this if you've done some gardening. Then you have a chemical, which is a plant-killing chemical, usually a herbicide, and that's used. Again, you're probably familiar with this if you ever sprayed weed killer in your garden. Then you have biological, which is when a natural enemy from the native range is reintroduced or introduced to help control the invasive species. And the last method is the ecosystem management, which is when habitats can resist invaders better if they're managed properly. So when individuals go in and they work to fix or manage a habitat to help control these invasive species, giving the native species a chance to fight back. Shrinking habitats and invasive species pose a risk to the survival of native species. Recognizing that risk, in 1973, the U.S. Congress passed the Endangered Species Act to protect species from extinction, which makes it illegal to carry out activities that threaten the continued existence of listed species or their habitats. This is another example of something that many people consider that was just for animals, but it's not just for animals, it's also for plants who are also endangered. This act classifies select species as either endangered or threatened. An endangered species is in danger of extinction throughout all or significant portions of its region. A threatened species is likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future. So if you had to choose, you really don't want either, but you would rather a threatened species than endangered. So it goes from threatened to endangered to extinct. The Endangered Species Act has actually helped many species come back from the brink of extinction. The Humboldt Bay, California, is home to two endangered flowering plants, the beach laya and the Humboldt Bay wallflower. The coastline environment in which these plants live is pretty fragile, but a productive ecosystem. These endangered plants are adapted to the poor soil and the harsh ocean storms. However, invasive plant species have forced them to near extinction. Since 1995, the U.S. Bureau of Land Management and the California Conservation Corps have been working to restore the Humboldt Bay habitat. Workers and volunteers have pulled up the invasive European beach grass and other exotics and replanted native dune grasses, and their efforts have paid off. The habitats have been restored and the population size of both these endangered plants has increased. So hopefully a lot of this stuff wasn't too terribly new to you, but in case it is, let's just review what we went over this whole lesson and hit some of the highlights. Extinction is a process by which members of a species die off, either naturally or through human activities. Human activities have increased the rate of the extinction of plant species. The main causes are habitat destruction and fragmentation. Native species are indigenous and environmentally stable. Exotic species are non-native and are accidentally or deliberately introduced by humans. Invasive plant species are exotic species that are environmentally harmful. As the habitats of plant species are reduced or damaged, the species may become threatened or endangered. Laws are now in place to help protect endangered species.